Hello everyone, welcome to Excel with Isaac series, and in this video I'm going to be teaching you cell referencing. Now cell referencing is one of the most important topics in Excel you need to master on your journey to becoming good in Excel. If you are somebody that is interested in writing formulas, cell referencing is an absolute must. Anytime you write a formula, one of the things that you note is that you are either dragging down, dragging left, dragging right, or dragging up. And understanding cell referencing will go a long way into ensuring that you are very effective when you're writing your formulas. And so in this video, we'll be looking at the various cell locking variations, which is how to unlock rows and columns. We'll also look at locking the row, unlocking the column. We'll also look at unlocking the row, locking the column, and then we'll also look at locking both the row and the column. Throughout these four techniques, one of the things that I'll be helping you understand is the concept of referencing. So in Excel, we have both the relative reference and the absolute reference. So whilst you are going through the cell locking techniques, I'll let you know what relative reference is and what absolute reference is. Then after going through the techniques, we are going to practice some examples. This is to help you solidify your understanding with the concepts. The examples have been structured in such a way that if you're able to go through these examples, you would have a working knowledge of cell referencing, and it will be enough to be able to tackle any kind of problem you face whilst writing formulas. Then once you are done with the practice, I'll also show you an easy way to toggle the lock on and off. And then we'll go into hard coding values and the drawbacks. As much as possible, try not to hard code your values. And then I'll throw in a bonus using cell locking as to how we can calculate our running total or cumulative sum. So with that, let's begin. So we'll be starting with unlocking the rows and the column reference. And this is the default option Excel gives you anytime you're writing your formulas. So let's write a simple formula referencing the column B. And to write a formula in Excel, you always begin with your equal to sign. So we start with equal to cell B4. And how we know this is B4 is B is the column, 4 is the row. Where the column and the row meets is called the cell. So we reference cell B4 and we hit enter. Now, one of the things you realize is that if you look at the reference, which is cell B4, you see that the B has not been locked and the 4 has not been locked. So the row 4 is unlocked, the B4 is unlocked. Now, anytime you have your row and your column being unlocked, what you're telling Excel is that when I drag, follow me along when I drag. So let's see what happens when we drag down. Let's see what happens to the reference B4. So when I drag down one step, we see that the reference has moved from B4 to B5 because the 5 has not been locked. So the way Excel understands this is, okay, you're trying to drag down. First thing I need to do is to check your reference. Excel comes to look at the 5 and sees that, okay, the 5 has not been locked. So what Excel does is that since the 5 has not been locked, if you drag down, the reference moves from 4 to 5. And if I drag down again, let's see what happens. The reference has moved to B6 because the row number 6 has not been locked. Now let's say I copy this reference at G6 and I want to paste at G13. In order to copy, use Ctrl C, and when you come to G13, you hit Ctrl V. Now, Excel has been able to determine that as at the time you were in cell G6, you were referencing B6, which is number 3. Now that you've copied and jumped all the way to G13, you see that the reference has also followed you to G13, again because the row has not been locked. Now let's go back to deleting all of this and let's see what happens when we drag to the left side. Now if you drag to the left side, let's see what happens. So I drag to the left side. You see that the reference has moved from B to C. And to Excel, anytime you are dragging to the left side or to the right hand side, the first thing Excel does is that Excel comes to look at the formula that you wrote and check the column. So in this case, we are in column C. So now the question Excel asks, say if you drag to the left side again, is that, okay, you are dragging to the left side. Excel comes to check, I'm on C. If I drag to the left side, since C is unlocked, this reference is unlocked, Excel will move to D. And as you can see, Excel has moved from C to D. If you copy the reference here and you jump 2 steps, okay, so currently the reference is at D. Now, if you copy this cell and jump to K and paste all happen, the reference will also move 2 steps, so 1, 2. So that means the reference will move from D to F. So now we copy this, we come here, we paste, see what happens. The reference has moved from D to F. Again, this is possible because in the formula bar, the column has not been locked. So now let's take all of this off. Now the next thing we need to look at is ranges. So in Excel, a range is selecting more than one cell. If I want to sum the first 3 cells here, I use the sum function, which is equal to sum, right? And once the IntelliSense starts giving you options, if you want to apply the option, you hit the tab key. So now let's sum this range. So I click on the first selection and then I hold and drag down. And as you can see, I've selected a range from B4 to B6. Now, what makes you know that this is a range is anytime you're writing a range, Excel introduces the semicolon. So selecting more than one cell in Excel is a range, or anytime there's a semicolon between one cell and another cell, Excel sees that it's a range. So now let's close brackets. So now we've summed from cell B4 to cell B6, and we have a value of 6. Now let's see what happens when we drag down this formula. So when I drag down one step, what has happened? The range has moved from B4, that started now from B5 to B7, because again, anytime you are dragging down, the question Excel asks is this. It comes to check your formula and sees that 4 has not been locked, which is row 4. 6 has also not been locked, which is row 6. What that means is when I drag my formula down, the 4 will move down to 5, and then the 6 will move down to 7, which you can see in this cell. You can see that 4 has moved to 5 and the 6 has moved to 7. So the more you keep dragging down, the more the range moves with you. So at the last section, you can see that the range has moved all the way from 13 to 15 because it is moving as you are dragging down. Now let's see what happens to the range when we drag to the right side of the sheet. So now if I drag to the right side, you can see that the range has also moved with us as we move to the right side, because when you drag to the right side, Excel will come back to the formula and come and check, okay, you were here as at the time you were the formula, and now you're coming to drag to the right side. Excel comes to check, has the B been locked, which is the column, sees that, okay, the B's have not been locked. So if you drag to the right side, Excel knows that the reference should move from B4 to 6 and then moves to C4 to 6 because you are dragging to the right side. Similarly, if you drag to the left side, you see that the range has moved one step to the left side. So now the ability of the Excel range to move to the left, to the right, up or downwards, based on the direction that you move when you're dragging, is what Excel refers to as relative referencing. Now the reason why it's a relative reference is because Excel is moving relative to you. So the reference, which is this reference, moves relative to you. So anytime you move down, the reference moves down with you. Anytime you move right, the reference moves right with you. And anytime you move left, the reference moves left with you. The reason why the reference moves again is because both the row and the column have been unlocked. And by default, anytime you write a formula, Excel by default unlocks the row and the column. So you can practice unlocking the rows and columns, which is a default way Excel gives you. You can reference a cell in your formula and drag up, left, down, right, and see how the reference moves with you whilst you are dragging. So with this, we are done with the first way of locking cells, which is unlocking the rows and the columns. So now let's move on to the next way. In this technique, we are looking at locking the row and unlocking the column reference. So again, let's write a simple formula which is referencing B4, which will be equal to B4, and we hit enter. Now this time around, we want to lock the row. So in order to lock the row, what we do is that we come to the formula bar, and in front of the row, you put your cursor in front of the row number, which is a 4, and then you input the $sign. And the $sign on your number keyboard should be at where the number 4 is written. So input your $sign and you hit enter. Now when you input the $sign and hit enter, the next thing you're coming to do is we are coming to fill the formula down or drag down with the formula. And let's see what happens. So now we drag down with the formula and we see that the 1 is still being repeated. So unlike the first technique, which was unlocking the rows and columns, this time when we lock the row, we see that when we drag down, Excel is still referencing row 4. Why is that? So now anytime you're about to drag down, Excel again goes back to your formula bar and says, okay, Isaac is about to drag down. Let me come and look at his row reference. Has the row reference been locked? If the row reference has been locked, The way Excel understands this is, okay, if he's dragging down, I shouldn't move the row down. I should keep the row in place because I can see that Isaac has logged row 4. So because of that, anytime you lock the row, regardless of how many times you drag down, Excel will still reference the row that has been locked. And as you can see, even though I apply the formula to the bottom, Excel is still referencing the cell B4 because although I'm trying to drag down the rows, Excel still understands that I've locked the 4. So even though I'm dragging down, Excel is still referencing row 4 because the cell has been locked. Again, if you look in the formula bar, row 4 has been locked. Now let's see what happens when we decide to drag to the right side and to the left side. So when we drag to the right side, what we see is that rather than seeing 1, we are seeing 0 because Excel comes back to the formula bar. So when we come to the initial formula, Excel comes back to the formula bar and says, okay, Isaac is trying to drag to the right hand side. Let me check his formula. Has B been logged? Because anytime you try to drag to the right or to the left, the part of the cell that moves is the column. So now Excel comes to check, has B been logged? Excel sees that B hasn't been logged. So now when you drag to the right side, the reference moves from B to C. And now when I come back here and I apply the formula to the left side, we see that the reference moves from B to A because again, the column reference has not been logged. So anytime you write the formula, it's made up of 2 elements, the column reference and the row reference. In this example, the row reference has been logged. So you realize that trying to drag down along the rows, it doesn't work because Excel is still referencing the row that has been logged. However, if you want to drag right or left, Excel can move the reference from C, that's to the right, or A, that's to the left, because the column reference has not been locked. And with that, you can go to the third technique. Okay, so now moving on to the third technique, which is unlocking the row reference, but this time we are locking the column reference. And again, let's write a simple formula reference in cell B4, which is equal to B4. So we hit enter. So now this time around, rather than locking the row, let's lock the column. And to do that, let's introduce the $ in front of the B, and then we hit enter. Now, once we introduce the $ in front of the B, let's see what happens when we drag down. So when we drag down 1 step, you see that the reference has also moved from 4 to 5. Why? Because anytime you write a formula, you're about to drag down your reference. Excel goes to check in your formula bar. Has the row been locked? Excel can see that the row has not been locked, which means anytime you drag down to the next row, Excel will move the reference with you. And as you can see, I've dragged down from 2 to 3, and the reference has also moved from B5 to B6 because, again, the row reference has not been locked. So now let's come back up and try to drag to the right side. So now when we drag to the right side, what happens? Excel is still referencing the same column B because Excel comes to check the formula bar and says, okay, so Isaac is trying to now drag to the right hand side. Let me come and check the column that Isaac is referencing. Has it been locked? Excel now sees that, okay, the column has been locked. So the way Excel interprets this is that regardless of the direction Isaac is moving, whether to the left or to the right, in this case to the right, no matter how many times Isaac drags to the right, still keep the reference on B because B has been locked. However, if Isaac decides to drag down, Excel now comes to check, has the row been locked? Excel sees that the row has been unlocked. And so if I drag down, Excel moves the reference 1 step with me as I drag. And as you can see, the reference has moved from B4 to B6. Now in the previous technique, I left out the range. So let's sum a range of cells and then lock the column portion of the cells. And let's see what happens. So to sum the range will be equal to sum. Okay, we select the range by highlighting the 3 cells and then we close brackets and we hit enter. Now this time around, we want to lock the columns of the range. So let's come to B and put the $ in front of B. Come to the next B, put the $ and we hit enter. So let's see what happens when we drag down. Again, when we drag down, we realize that the reference moves from B4 and now starts from B5 to B7. Why? Because Excel comes to check in your formula and then Excel realizes that the rows have not been locked. So anytime you are trying to drag down row by row, Excel moves the reference from one row to the next. Now let's see what happens when we drag to the right side. If I move to the right side, we realize that Excel is still referencing column B because again, Excel comes into your range and realizes that, okay, the column portion of the range has been locked. So what that means is that anytime Isaac is trying to drag to the left or to the right hand side, still reference the column B because Isaac has locked the column B. So even if I drag 3 spaces to the right hand side, Excel is still going to reference. However, the moment I drag down one step, you see that Excel moves the reference one step down again because the row portion of the formula has not been locked. And with that, we are done with the third technique. So now let's move on to the fourth and final technique. So now in the fourth and final technique of cell locking, we are looking at locking both the row and the column reference. And again, let's reference cell B4, which will be equal to B4. We hit enter. Now let's go back to the formula bar and this time introduce the dollar symbol in front of the column B and introduce the dollar symbol in front of the row B. Now let's see what happens when we decide to drag down. So now when we apply the formula downwards, we see that Excel is still referencing cell B4. If we come here, we can see that Excel is still referencing cell B4 because as at the time you wrote the formula and you want to drag down, Excel comes to check, okay, Isaac wants to drag down from row to row. Now let me check if the row has been locked. Excel sees that a dollar sign is in front of the row number 4. And so because of that, Excel understands that the row has been locked. So what that means is that if you try dragging down one step from row 4 to row 5, it doesn't work because Excel has locked the row number 4. So even if we drag down to the bottom and we check, Excel is still referencing row 4 because row 4 has been locked. Now let's see what happens if we decide to drag to the right hand side. If we drag to the right hand side, we can see that Excel is still referencing the cell B4 because again, when you decide to drag, Excel comes to check the formula that you wrote and sees that the column has been locked because there's a dollar sign in front of the column. And the way in which Excel understands this is you are referencing column B4. However, you are trying to drag to the right hand side. Even though you are dragging to the right hand side, I'm still going to reference cell B because the column B has been locked. So now you realize that if you lock both the row and the column in your formula, in any direction that you drag, whether left, right, up or down, Excel is still going to reference the cell that you referenced in your formula. And so in any direction that you drag, the reference doesn't move. The reference stays in place. Now in the previous techniques where the reference moves with you, remember I called it a relative reference because the reference moves in the direction that you move. Now, the other form of referencing, where when you move, the cell does not move with you, is what Excel refers to as absolute reference. So it's an absolute reference because in any direction that you drag, the cell reference does not move. It does not change. So now let's practice this using a range of cells. So I delete all of this. And now let's sum a range of cells. So I write my sum function, I hit the tab key to open the bracket, and let's highlight from 4 to 6, and then close bracket, hit enter. So as you can see, I've written my formula. Let's apply our cell locking. So in this case, we come to the first part of the formula and we introduce the dollar sign for the B. So let's lock the B's, which are the columns. And then for the rows too, let's introduce the dollar sign for the rows too. So we lock the rows as well. So in this case, we've locked the entire range, the first part of the range, B4, and then the range is moving all the way to B6, which is here. So this is the entire range. And as you can see, we've locked both the first part and the second part of the range. Now let's hit our enter key. And let's see what happens if we decide to drag down. Now when we drag down, we realize that Excel is still referencing the same range that we used in the beginning because again, Excel comes to the formula bar to check, okay, so Isaac wants to drag down this range. Let me come and check the rows because dragging down or up deals with the rows. So Excel comes to check, has the 4 been locked? Okay, if the 4 has been locked, I need to stay in that position even if I'm dragging down. Then Excel also comes to check, has the 6 been locked? Okay, the 6 has been locked. So regardless of how Isaac drags up or down, I'm still going to stay in 4 to 6. So regardless of the number of times we drag down or up, Excel still references the initial range that you referenced. Now let's see what happens if we decide to drag to the right side. Now, when we drag to the right side, we realize that the reference still stays in place because anytime you are dragging to the right or to the left, Excel understands it as, okay, Isaac has written a formula. He wants to move to the right. Now, let me come and check the column reference because the column has to deal with dragging to the left or to the right. So Excel comes to check the column reference and realizes that Isaac has logged B here. Isaac has also logged B here. So what that means is, regardless of how many times Isaac drags to the right side, I'm still going to keep the reference at B, column B. So now the ability of Excel to not move regardless of the direction in which you move is what we term as an absolute reference. And with that, we are done with all the 4 techniques of referencing. If you are feeling a bit overwhelmed, you can go back, play the video, go back again, watch it again, practice just to get the hang of it. Once you feel like you get the hang of it, you can move on to the next phase of today's video, which is our practice sessions. And with the practice sessions, it's supposed to solidify all of these concepts that we've learned up until this point. So with that, let's move on to the practice sessions. So now the first example that we need to apply cell locking is to this problem. Imagine you have various months here, your sales amount, but you want to apply a 10% discount to this sales amount and show what the value of the 10% discount is. So now let's write the formula to apply the discount to this amount, which will be equal to, we click on the 10%, right? And then we multiply. The multiplication symbol is at number 8 on your keyboard. So we multiply by the sales amount and we hit enter. Now, if you had no knowledge of cell referencing and you wrote this formula, let's see what happens when we drag down. So I click and I drag down and see what happens. You see that Excel is giving us inconsistent results because now when I come here and click, see that the reference has moved from the 10%, which is C3, to C4. And that's the wrong reference. So now because the reference is moving, we see that the kind of results that you're expecting to see is not what is happening. And so you're running into errors. So now let me clear this up. So now how do we apply cell locking in such a way that the 10% can be held in place? And even as we drag down, the 10% will be applied to all the sales amount. We come back to the formula that we wrote, which was multiplying cell C3, which is the 10%, versus the sale amount, which was in B7. And the first thing that you need to do is what we did, is to write the formula, which is this times this. So that's the first thing you need to do. Now the next thing you need to do is to determine which cells to lock. So we always start from the left-hand side. So we come to the cell C3. And then the question you ask yourself is, after writing this formula, I'm going to be dragging down. So now for cell C3, if I decide to drag down, do I want the cell C3, the 3? Mind you, the rows are the numbers. So do I want the reference, which is 3, to move to the reference 4? Now, if the answer is yes, it means you do not have to lock the 3. But if the answer is no, it means you have to lock the 3. In this case, we'll be applying the formula downwards. So the answer to whether we want the 3 to move to 4 when we drag down will be no, because we want the reference to still be in row 3. So in this case, what we have to do is come to the 3 and introduce the $sign. So now we have locked the 3. And the next thing we need to look at is the B7, which is the second part of the formula. Again, we'll be dragging downwards. So the question you ask is, if I drag downwards, do I want the 7? Again, if you drag downwards, we are dealing with the rows. If I drag down, do I want the 7 to move to 8? And if I keep dragging, do I want the 8 to move all the way to 16? The answer is yes, because we want to be multiplying a 10% discount versus the sales amount as we drag. So once we are able to answer these questions, it means that for the B7, we do not lock any of the elements, whether the column or the row. We do not lock any of them, because when we drag down, we want the row to move from 7 to 8 to 9 and so on and so forth. So once you've been able to answer the questions, we hit the enter key. And with that, we can now drag down. So now let's apply the formula downwards and see what happens. So as you can see, the formula is now working. If we come to say this cell and double click, you see that the formula is doing what we expect it to do, which is to multiply the 10% by the sales amount. If we come down to the bottom and we check, we see that the formula is still doing what we want it to do, which is to multiply the 10% with the sales amount. So this is the first example of using cell referencing to write one formula and dragging down with the formula still working. So with that, we can move on to the second example. Now for the second example, this time around, we want to apply a 10% discount to the sales amount in this column. However, when we drag to the right hand side, we want the discount applied to the sales amount to move from a 10% to a 15%. How do we approach this? Now, if you do not know cell locking, probably one of the ways you would have approached this is equal to the sales amount times the 10% discount. You hit enter, then you come to the next one and do equal to your sales amount times the 15% discount. Now, without cell locking, that means you have to repeat the step for this amount, this amount, this amount, come to discount amount 2 and do the same thing. So that means you'll be doing that a total of roughly 30 times, which is cumbersome. So how do we write one formula to address this problem? So let's delete everything we have here. And again, we start by writing your formula, which is equal to the sales amount times the discount, and we hit enter. So always write the formula first. When you're done, you go back to the formula bar, and now we start asking our questions. Again, we start from the left-hand side, and we are starting with cell F7 this time around. And the first question we need to ask is that, okay, after writing this formula, I'm going to be dragging down and I'm going to be dragging to the right-hand side. So I need to answer some questions. The first question is, if I drag down, do I want the cell, which is the F7, the 7 portion, to move to 8, to 9, to 10? If the answer is yes, it means you do not have to lock the 7. You do not have to lock the 7. So in this case, because when we drag down, we want the amount to be moving as we drag, we do not lock the 7. Now the next thing we need to answer is the F portion of this cell. If we drag down, what will happen? If we drag down, we'll still be in column F. So in this case, we may not lock the F if we are dragging down. However, now we want to drag to the right-hand side. So the question we have to ask is, if I drag to the right-hand side, do I want this reference to move from F to G? Now, the question is no, because if we drag to the right-hand side, this reference will move from the blue to G. So to be referencing this cell, which is not what we want. We want it to still reference this cell, even if we drag to the right-hand side. So in this case, because we do not want the reference to move from F to G, what do? We come and introduce the $sign in front of the F. And so we've locked column F. Now the next thing we need to do is come to cell G3, which is this cell being the discount. Again, we ask ourselves the same question. If I decide to drag down, do I want this cell reference, which is the 3, to move to 4, 5, 6 as I'm dragging? The answer is no, because we still want the discount 10% to be applied when we are moving down. So in this case, if you are moving down the row, we do not want this cell to move down. So in this case, since we do not want the cell to move down, what do? We lock row 3. Now the next question we need to ask is that, if I move to the right-hand side, do I want the column portion of the cell, which is G, to move to H? The answer is yes, because when I move to the right-hand side, I want to apply the 15% discount to the sales amount. So in this case, because I want the G to move to H, it means that I do not have to lock the G portion of the cell. So I do not lock the G portion. So with that, let's hit our enter key. So now that we hit our enter key, we get our amount. And now if we drag down, we see that the formula is working because we want to apply 10% to the amount. Now what happens if we drag to the right-hand side? If we drag to the right-hand side, we also see that our formula is working, because when we drag to the right, we want the discount to move from 10% to 15%. And that's what has happened in this cell. So now when we drag down, we see that the reference is still working. So what you've done now is that you've written one formula that you drag to the right, and then you drag downwards, and the formula is still working as it should. And so with that, we are done with the second example. Let's move on to the third example. Now for the third examples, we have three names: Harold, Della, Emmanuel. Harold's sales amount is 50,000, Della's own is 40,000, Emmanuel is 30,000. We want to be able to write a formula where we apply 10% discount to Harold's sales amount, Della and Emmanuel's sales amount when we drag to the right hand side. And when we drag down, we want to apply a 15% discount to the sales amount. So how do we go about this? Using cell referencing or cell locking. So we start by first writing the base formula, which is we multiply the sales amount by the discount. So once we do that, we've written our base formula. So we go back into the formula bar and then we start asking our questions. So let's go into the formula bar. So we start with the cell K5. So the question you ask yourself is, if I drag to the right hand side, do I want the 10% to be applied to the sales amount? And then the answer for that is that currently you are in column K. If you drag to the right hand side, the K portion will move to L. If that's what you want to happen, then it means you do not have to lock the K. But if that is not what you want to happen, it means you have to lock the K. In this case, we want the K to move to L to M when we drag to the right hand side. So in this case, we do not lock the K portion of the cell. Now we come to the 5 portion of the cell. And the question we ask is, if we drag downwards in this formula, if we drag downwards, do we want the 5 to move to the 6? And the answer for that is no. We still want to be referencing the sales amount. So in this case, we need to lock the 5. So we come to the 5 and introduce a dollar sign. So now we've answered the first portion of the formula. And for the next portion, which is the J7 cell, the first question we ask is, if I decide to drag right, do I want the J portion, again, dragging right or left deals with the columns. So do I want the J portion to move to K? The answer is no. I want the J to still remain because I want to apply this 10% discount and I do not want this to move cell to K. So because we do not want this, what do we have to do? We need to lock the J portion of the cell. So now we lock the J portion of the cell. So now the next question is, if we drag down, we want the discount amount to move from the 10% to the 15%. And the answer is yes. So in this case, for the 7 portion of the cell, we keep unlocked. So now that we are done with locking the various cells in the formula, we can hit our enter key. So now let's drag to the right and see what happens. So now when we drag to the right, we can clearly see that the 10% has been applied to the amount. And now let's drag to the bottom. We also see that the 15% has been applied to the sales amount. And in dragging to the right hand side, the 15% is still applied to the sales amount. So now with one formula that we've written, we've been able to drag right and downwards, and the formula is still applying. And this is the power of cell referencing. If you're able to master cell locking, when to lock the column, when to lock the row, when to unlock the column, when to unlock the row, you'll be able to unlock how to write effective formulas, and you'll be way more efficient in your Excel use. So now that we are done with the third example, let's move on to the fourth example, which is hard coding values. So before we move on to the fourth example, which is hard coding values, and why you shouldn't hard coding values, let's go back to the first example. And let me demonstrate something simple for you. Up until this point, when we're locking cells, we're manually going into the formula bar and then we hit the dollar sign to toggle the lock. But there's a faster way to toggle the lock, which I'll be showing you. So let's apply this to this first example again, which is a 10% discount on the sales amount. So that'll be equal to the sales amount times the 10% discount. And then hit enter. Okay. So now if you want to apply the lock, in this case, you want to apply the lock on the 3 in the discount cell, which is C3. If you want to apply the lock you highlight the cell you want to apply the lock on, and then you press the F4 key. Now, when you press the F4 key, what Excel does by default is to lock the rows and the columns together. If after pressing F4, this didn't work for you, chances are your function key on your keyboard has been turned off. So if you look at the bottom left portion of your keyboard, you should see a key with FN written on it, which is the function key. For some of you, this might be off, so you need to turn this on for it to work. And to turn this on, you need to select the function key. So keep your hand on the function key. And then when you look at your escape key, you should see FN lock written on the escape key. For some of you, it might not be written. But with your hand on the function key, you press your escape key. And then your light comes on the escape key. But for some people, the lights may not come on your display. You should see function lock on off. Or some people, it might not be on off. But the way to turn it on is to press the function key. Down on your function key, press the escape key. So once you do that, the function key is on, and then try the F4 again by highlighting the cell and then hitting F4. So let's get back to this. So once you hit F4 the first time, Excel applies the lock on both the column and the row. And with the cell highlighted again, you hit F4 again. The second time locks the row. If you hit F4 again, the third time locks the column. And if you hit F4 for the last time, the cell is unlocked. Both the row and columns are unlocked. So you can try that again. F4, lock both. F4 again, unlock the column, lock the row. F4 locks the column, unlocks the row. F4 again, everything is unlocked. You can also try that with a range of cells. Say you wanted to sum this range of cells and you wanted to lock it. The way we do that is you come into the reference. If you press the F4 the first time, you see that Excel applies the lock automatically for you on the range. If you press F4 again, Excel applies the lock on only the rows. If you press F4 again, Excel applies the lock on the columns. And if you press F4 again, Excel releases everything. So this is just something I wanted to throw in there. If you are comfortable manually using the dollar symbol to lock, that's fine. But if you want to toggle the lock automatically, you can use the F4 key with your function key being turned on. So now let's go back to the fourth example, which was to hard code formulas. Now, when it comes to writing formulas, one of the best practice is not to hard code formulas, but rather using a reference. And let me demonstrate. Supposing you wanted to apply 10% to the sales amount across, and you wanted to hard code the 10%. Hard coding simply means actually typing the value in the formula bar. So you come into the formula bar, you hit equal to, you take your amount, and then you multiply by 10%. But rather than referencing a value, you type in manually 10%. Okay. And it will still work because when you drag down, you realize that the 10% is still working. Now, this is where things become complicated. Imagine you had a lot of rows, say 100 rows, and you were working across multiple sheets, applying 10% across those sheets, and you were hard coding all the 10%. If, say, tomorrow your company comes or whatever you're working on, they are saying that we no longer want a 10%, we want a 15% discount. That means you have to go back to all your preceding sheets, come back into the formula bar, and then come and change this to 15%, which you can see will be a lot of work. So as much as possible, it is in your best interest to have a reference the cell, and then let every other thing in the formula pick from that cell that you've referenced. That way, if you have to make any changes to the cell reference to change the value of anything, all you need to do is to go to your reference, change the value, and you are good to go. So as much as possible, try not to hard code your values. Always reference a cell. That way you can be more efficient in the way you use Excel. So with that, we are done covering everything we need to know about cell referencing. If you are struggling, you can go back to the previous examples on locking rows, locking columns, trying the practice examples over and over again till you get a hang of it. And now we can move on to the bonus section, which is how do we use cell referencing to calculate your running totals. Now, for Those of you who don't know what a running total or a cumulative sum is, I've demonstrated that in column B. So we want to apply a cumulative sum as we drag downwards from row to row. How do we write a formula to apply this cumulative sum from row to row till we get to the row 13? And the way the cumulative sum works is when you start at, say, row 4, you start with 1. When you drag down, it's supposed to sum 1 and 2 to get 3. If you drag down, it's supposed to sum 1, 2, and 3 to get 6. If you drag down 1, 2, 3, 4, that'll be 6, that'll be 7 plus 3, 10. And then you go all the way to the bottom. So by the time you drag to the bottom, you'll be summing as you are going along the rows. So how do we do that? Using cell locking. Now remember in the previous examples, I talked about a range in Excel, and a range in Excel being selecting 2 or 3 cells, or also a range being the semicolon introduced between the cell name. So for instance, if I write a formula, say sum, okay, and then I select these 2 cells, what makes this a range is the colon in between, showing that I'm moving from 4 to 5. However, there are instances where you can write a range on the cell itself. So in this case, rather than move from A4 to A5, let's tell Excel that we want to move from A4 to A4. So in effect, it's almost like we are not moving. So you select A4 to A4. And then with your knowledge of cell locking, let's see what we need to do. Now the sum function sums values based on what you supply the function. So in this case, we've given the function this range, which is from range A4 to A4. So if you hit the sum on this, this is the value you get. And as always, you begin by first writing your formula. So now we come to the first cell, and then we ask ourselves the question, if I drag down for this first part of the range, do I want A4 to move to A5? The answer is no. I do not want 4 to move to 5. I want to keep 4 still at A4. However, when I come to this portion of the range, when I drag down, I would want this to move from 4 to 5. And if I keep dragging, I want it to move from 5 to 6. So now you can see how to play. It will start by summing A4 to A4. When you drag down, in this cell, it's going to be summing A4 to A5. And when you drag down again, in this cell, it's going to be summing A4 to A6. So by the time you get to the last cell, you've been able to have a cumulative sum of the numbers. So let's apply a lock on the row number in this case, which will be putting a $ in front of the 4. But if you want to toggle with the F4, you highlight the range, you press F4. The first one toggles both. You press F4 again. We are now locking just the row portion. For this part of the range, we do not need to lock anything here. So once we are done, we hit enter. And then we can apply the formula downwards and see if it works. So as you can see, as we move downwards, we are performing a running total or a cumulative sum of the numbers. So by the time we get to the final cell, we've applied a cumulative sum to the final cell. And if you want to see how this is working, you come into the second cell after you write the formula. You go into the formula bar. You see that the range has extended. You come into the next cell, you go into your formula bar. You also see that the range keeps extending. Why? Because for the first portion of the range, you've locked the row, so that portion doesn't move. But for the second portion of the range, you've unlocked the row, and so that portion can move up until the last cell. And this allows you to be able to perform a running total. If you've made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe, share with your friends, colleagues, anyone that you think this knowledge will be helpful to. And with that, I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.